Uh, Hello? You're YouTube? I guess you're here to see my toys. Well, I never really show my toys to anyone. You want to come in? Yeah. Can you promise me you're not going to play with anything? Now, okay. Come on in. Whoa! Stop. This is China. We wear rubber slippers when we come to someone's home.
Hello, YouTube. Welcome to another episode of Star Wars Collections and Displays. As always, I'm Jack. I'm here tonight with Jim. We also have a gentleman, a collector here. His name is Shannon. Shannon, if you would please take a moment, introduce yourself, tell us who you are, where you're from, and a little bit about your collection.
Okay, so my name is Shannon. I'm from Canada. 46 years old. So I was a Star Wars baby. And I have been living in China since 2005.
Wow.
International! So I've spent a third of my life now living in China, and I live in a city about an hour from Shanghai, named Hangzhou. We're like the birthplace of Alibaba, Jack Ma, that kind of thing.
Alibaba was Chinese?
And
Well, the company Alibaba.
yeah. Yeah. Yes.
The Amazon of China.
Yes.
Okay.
The genie is out of the bottle. Aha. So collecting wise, living in China for quite a long time, it's normal for a lot of us to be semi-transient in terms of you might, come over in a city and start teaching, which is what I did after university. And you might stay in a city for 2 years, and then you might move to another city. And also, when I came over here, everyone had Motorola candy bar phones or Nokia candy bar phones. There was no online presence in terms of digital commerce, shopping, stuff like that. So the collection that I'm going to be talking about today has basically all been amassed in the last 3 years. Since my wife and I bought our small home, an apartment here that we bought, and where it's like, okay, I'm not going to be moving. I'm stable in my current job. So it kind of gave me self-permission to open the floodgates of collecting.
Interesting.
And partly her to blame, because I started living in the apartment about 3 months before her and my son, because my son was at a school across town. So I was living here alone for a little while and staring at what's behind me, empty shelving, and looking at boxes of figures that I had stored under the bed. And it was like, well, if I just put one, maybe they won't notice. And then by the time they moved in, like, this was all up here. So it was too late. The living room kind of became mine.
Got stuck right on in.
Yeah.
All right. Fantastic. I just want to kind of comment. I'm really excited that we've gone fully worldwide. We've been fortunate to have done a couple of people in Australia, a fellow out of Sweden. We've got an upcoming one out of England, but now we can kind of go to the Far East, I guess we would call it, in this case,
Yeah.
China, which ironically is probably where a lot of this stuff is actually manufactured. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any variations between what you have and what comes to the US versus also what else may be available in China itself. So that being the case, let's dive on into it. Start with my first set of questions, and they are, what is it that you're collecting? Is it action figures, vehicles, helmets, lightsabers, comics?
I'm a sucker for a 3 3/4 inch action figure. And I think a big reason for that is growing up not only as a sort of Saturday morning cartoon kid who was really into comic books and art, like drawing, copying comic covers, There's something about the art on the 3/4 carded figures that continues to just fascinate me. It's what I love the most. It's probably the main reason I don't collect Black Series. I started for a little bit, taking up a lot of space. I'm typically not an opener. I'm a keeper in the package usually. So the Black Series to me never hooked me in quite the same way that the carded figures have in 3 3/4 inch. Even Hasbro, which I kind of take what I can get, being where I live. That said, though, I mean, comics, I've been able, again, everything here was purchased in China the last 3 years, vintage 80s Marvel, Star Wars comics, some of the Dark Horse. So I still love to get my comics. Some of the artwork and books and things, they're all in storage. I can't cross that barrier into helmets and lightsabers quite yet until, if one day I had a man cave, that's a different story.
Right. So 3 3/4 is the scale or the size. Is there a particular series, story, or movie that you have an appreciation for?
So definitely the original trilogy, and I'm probably a sucker for Empire Strikes Back more than even any of those, probably because that was the first one I saw in the theater. And to me, some of the aesthetic designs really took a jump up when you're looking at some of the armor, Boba Fett, the bounty hunters. I just loved Luke in fatigues, and some of the aesthetics of the scenes, even Lobot. I loved Lobot with his flowing shirt and his headgear. So a lot of Empire that I will keep an eye out for. Original trilogy, but I've gotten a bit hooked on the retro series because, again, if I could only collect Kenner vintage, that's probably what I would do. But I'm not able to. I've pretty much scoured the internet here and probably have whatever anyone has sold in the last 10 years of vintage Star Wars Kenner in China is probably in this living room. So some of the modern stuff, some of the Obi-Wan retro figures, obviously Mandalorian. The N1 was about the coolest thing I've opened since I was a kid, I have to say. So I kind of take what I can get.
Interesting. And quantity wise, you mentioned that some of it is still in storage, but in an approximation, how many pieces do you think you have?
If I were to take a guess, so I use actionfigure411.com. I don't know if you guys know the website. It allows you to keep an inventory and approximate price. It's just kind of nerdy fun to do it when you're sitting around. But they don't have loose options. They don't have any of the power of the force options. So it's pretty much all just modern Hasbro versions. And I've got 100 on that. And I would say probably have four times that amount of figures. So probably about 400 figures, and then other pieces, a variety of pieces, vehicles, comic books, etc.
Wow.
Impressive. What is it, Shannon, about Star Wars? There's a lot of pop culture out there that you can collect. Why Star Wars? What got you into that?
I think it's just that perfect mix of myth and magic and fantasy. So as a kid, probably like all of us were, for a while, Star Wars wasn't any weightier than G.I. Joe, than Mask, than even the A-Team for a while, probably. But then as you get older and Expanded Universe comes out, and if you would meet someone your age, it's more likely the first thing that you'd talk about from your childhood would be Star Wars. And I know G.I. Joe and Masters of the Universe are kind of close behind that. But, and then in college, I took a couple of anthropology courses, and one of them specialized in Joseph Campbell, and reading his book, The Power of Myth, and watching some of the interviews that he did with Bill Moyers, and realizing that George Lucas was sitting in his classroom at Joseph Campbell at the time, and how it featured into the lore making. I just always appreciated that. So then as you get older and you're connecting back to your roots, and you're finding grown men and women who are the same age as you, and you have that shared love of something, it kind of just grabs you a little bit. And then also the fact that it's continued to be in the public conscious, whether it was from when the EU started, okay, the takeover, whatever you want to call it. It's been the one that's kept me hooked. That said, I've heard Jim talk a little bit about G.I. Joe, and if I had a second where my money would go, it would be definitely G.I. Joe. But, you know, G.I. Joe is so splintered because I have difficulty re-watching the cartoons. But I love to reread the comic books, especially the Storm Shadow Snake Eyes lore of the comics. I don't find that, right? When you rewatch Star Wars, you're picking up all of the beautiful things you didn't notice upon rewatching them. So for me now, it's not only a piece of my childhood, but you know, when you're having a terrible day, it's easy to kind of meditate, lose yourself in a film, a story, a comic, even picking up a figure. So it's become kind of something that relieves anxiety for me as well. And I think that's quite important. Obviously, being so far away from home for so long, there's probably part of that maintaining a piece of identity that can stay with you no matter where you're living in the world.
Mm-hmm. A true comfort food. Yeah.
There you go.
There you go. For sure.
What would you say your motivation for collecting is? Is it investment purposes? Is it for decoration or looks? Is it enjoyment, or as you just mentioned a moment ago, an escape?
Probably more on the escape, enjoyment, and definitely some aesthetics and connection. In terms of investment, sure, it's on your mind, especially when you're a father. You're like, one day, son, this is going to send you to university. That's probably not going to happen. But I don't foresee a day, you know, outside of some catastrophic situation where I'm looking to take all of this and dump it off at a toy store. Plus, I don't really have one. We've got one opened by an American friend in a city across the country, which is an American style comic shop, which is fantastic. I buy a lot of stuff from them, a lot of my comics from them, but we don't really have that type of option anyways for cashing in on your investment.
Interesting. Of all the items that you have, is anything graded, and is there any market or area of interest for graded products over in China?
Typically not. I've got my eye on a graded IG-88 and a graded R2-D2 at this friend's Chengdu comic store, but they're, you know, about $200 per figure, loose, but, you know, graded. And I've got a couple of figures like this Klaatu, which is just in a star case. I got this for about $50 from Hong Kong, and it's unpunched and gradable, definitely. But I like to take it out sometimes. He does get a little bit of sun. So for me, it's probably not an avenue that I would be pursuing, but I totally get it. I mean, I like to have a few pieces just more as display, but to me, it would be a shame to have like everything graded that I couldn't be moving around. I have a shelf where I like to do dioramas and things like that. So, and it would be so difficult to do it from here. You'd have to send the stuff back to the States or the UK, get it through customs. Maybe that happens, maybe that doesn't. Wait the time and then get it back. Maybe that happens, maybe that doesn't. So it's not really something that I think is on the radar for a lot of collectors here.
That is interesting then, because, and Jack can confirm this here in a second, but there are two grading places. And obviously there's not one in China. So if you were going to pursue the graded stuff, you would be exporting it and re-importing it back in.
Yes. And everything gets opened at customs. They'll open it, they'll look through it. I've had shipments arrive where that's missing some items. It's been opened. Someone has decided like, oh, that looks cool. I'll take that.
Yeah.
So I haven't had shipments come or go even well before COVID, probably 6 years.
Okay.
So of the two reasons for having something graded, one being that it's been defined to be in a particular level of quality, and the other being to be encased, for lack of a better description, in a sealed, non-openable, if that's a real word, condition. There's really no interest on your part. And to top it off, that I think you call it a star case a moment ago, that kind of replaces the sealed acrylic box.
Yes, and if you look over my shoulder up there, I've got 2 carded Return of the Jedi figures, and they're in acrylic cases. Those are the same cases that CAS uses. They're probably manufactured here because I paid about $8 for each, $8 for each of those. So they're in there, and I have a Stand Solo over my shoulder, and he's in an acrylic case, just like a CAS case. So I would buy more of those, but I can take the figures out. I can choose who's going in them, and it's very, very cheap. I could have a box of those arrive in a week for about $80.
Well, you just touched on a word, and I'm going to now deviate from our normal set of questions and try to address something that separates you being in China from the rest of the people who we've had a chance to talk to. And that is, you use the phrase Stand Solo. And I've also gone through your videos, and there's a Smith Lord and a Dr. Alfra. Tell us what's different about those versus the normal stuff that we here in the States would get, which I'm going to assume Hasbro.
Yeah, so Stan Solo, or the guy who started it. By the way, let me preface this, because there might be viewers who have very contentious opinions about custom figures, or if you want to say counterfeit or reproduction, and I totally get it. Like I said, if I had $10 to spend back home in Canada, it would go towards vintage Kenner, but I'm out of options. So last year, or about 2 years ago, I came across this on my buying platform, this carded Power of the Force Boba Fett. And it was like $50. And I was like, okay, first, they never made that. Second, so it's not real, but it looks great. So I bought it. And when it arrived, I saw that it had the Smith Lord Collections logo on it. So that started me down a very long rabbit hole of research, Facebook groups, YouTube videos, that basically a Welsh guy named Chris Smith decided to start making custom Star Wars figures that were very similar to what Kenner had done, but doing characters that Kenner had never released, or doing versions of characters on cards that Kenner had never released. And this custom market has really taken off over the last couple of years. The Stan Solo stuff now, if you look on eBay, they're selling for hundreds and hundreds of dollars. The ones that I've been able to locate. I'm not planning on reselling them. But basically, about 2 years ago, the company, the original company, Smith Lord Creations, was transferring ownership to an American affiliate who had started to get the figures out to the American audience. And during the handover, Mr. Smith had reasons for wanting to sell the first company. This guy who took over started to engage in quite a lot of questionable, and now we're at the point now that we know it's quite fraudulent behavior of keeping customers' money on pre-orders and things like that. So Mr. Smith, Chris Smith, this guy from Wales, he started his new company, which is Stan Solo. The Stan Solo figures, like this one from 000 from Dr. Afra, again, Hasbro never made this, so it's not counterfeit, which gets these builders kind of around the rules for getting this into US soil. Because the US Customs, from what I understand, will not be looking at intellectual property. They'll be considering counterfeit items. So it would really be up to Hasbro, Disney, Marvel to pursue the IP legality of producing figures like that. And up until now, this doesn't appear something that is worth their while to go down that route of litigation and things like that. So as I started to learn more about the story, which is very convoluted, but basically the guy who bought his company, who was holding back customers' money, promising them figures, reported his new company and their factories. There are 3 that you have to use to produce a figure like this. You need 3 factories. He reported the factories to the Chinese authorities for intellectual property fraud and counterfeit. So a lot of these figures got stuck here, basically. There are figures that the factories produced that remain in China, and I was able to locate them through a lot of searching on the 2 buying platforms, and basically bought up, I have about 30 of them now that are sitting in my house. And the reality is that they're fantastic figures. Like, the cards are thicker than what Hasbro is doing. Some of the art that they put onto the figures, some of the variations of the droids that they have produced. And they're just really, really well made. So I just said, okay, I'm going to get these because I love the look of them. I'm fascinated by the story behind them. And I've been able to get them here where people are paying quite a lot for them back home right now.
Interesting. So it brings up a few questions then. Once the guy from Wales sold Smith Lord to the guy in the US, and the guy in the US started screwing the pooch, whatever came of the line of Smith Lord?
It's dead and gone.
Okay.
He adopted the name of the website that they sell through, which is called The Fan Strikes Back. Interesting website to check out, all the promises and updates that they're making on there. He had promised to produce 17 figures and get those to customers within like 3 months or 6 months, something ridiculous that is just not possible. The amount of time that it takes for 3 factories to produce 1 figure, where they have to do the steel molding in a factory, then you have a second factory that's doing all the detailing, the painting, and then you have the third factory that's assembling with the carding and everything. All of that is a long process, and these are small factories. These are not factories that Hasbro is using. These are probably like family, mom and pop, small factories down in the south of China. So it was a little bit fishy that he was promising 17 figures in such a short time, but he was taking people's money for them. And he hasn't been heard from in well over a year now. There's
so
Facebook groups of people who've lost.
He never ever did deliver the product.
He delivered a few figures, like this one, this Uze Boba Fett, is a Smith Lord figure that was produced during the handover. So my understanding, and again, I'm not an expert here, I'm just sharing the long rabbit hole that I've gone down, bits and pieces along the way. But my understanding is there were figures in the pipeline from the transfer that were being produced because they were paid for. They were already paid. The factory had their money. They produced figures which have Smith Lord after the handover. So this guy's able to go like, see, I did produce the figures. Have faith, have patience. But that was not in fact the case. He never actually produced figures with the money of the customers that he had taken.
Wow. And so Mr. Wales created a second line called Smith Lord and Dr. Alfra.
No, Chris Smith, who is the man who started Smith Lord, created the brand Stan Solo.
Right. Where did Smith? Maybe I've got this wrong. Then which Smith Lord was the one that came out first, and he sold that to the guy.
Smith Lord, and then it blew up.
Okay.
And in the middle of the process, he was like, "This guy's a cheater. I'm ready to make figures again. My new company with my new factories is called Stan Solo."
And where did the Dr. Alfra come from?
This is a character from one of the Marvel comics. So Dr. Afra is a character. She's like an Indiana Jones style archaeologist.
So it's not a brand
So
name,
they put
it's
it,
an actual character.
yeah. So these droids, there's two of them. They're like the Bizarro R2 and C3PO, where they love to murder people. So like this is a Hasbro, Disney Hasbro vintage of the characters. So Hasbro has been making these, but that just happens to be one of the ones that Stan Solo had done.
Okay. So when Mr. Smith from Wales came out with his Stan Solo line, one of the things that I saw when you held that up a moment ago was, granted, you said it was thicker a card and maybe a better plastic on there, but something that I saw on there and it said Kenner.
Yes, he's reproduced the card to look pretty identical to what the cards would have looked like if Kenner had ever produced R3PO back in the 80s. The card art, everything is the same. So again, an astute buyer, you've got to know it says Stan Solo right on there. He's not trying to cheat you. And anyways, Kenner never made that, but it's a custom reproduction, I guess is the most accurate term. It's a custom reproduction of what Kenner would have made if they made that character back in the 80s.
And aside from him copying, for lack of a better description, some of the original Star Wars Kenner characters, is there not an issue there putting Kenner's name on that package?
Kenner's not around anymore.
That was what I was thinking too. Okay. So what happened then to Mr. Smith and the Stan Solo line after Mr. Screw the Pooch in the US turned him in?
Basically, he was not able to get the molds back from those factories. They withheld them, and he was not able to get a lot of product back. I saw an interview where the desk weapons technician that's in the case back there behind me, I saw Mr. Smith give an interview where he didn't even have one of those yet. Now they're on eBay, you can find them. So people are starting to get them, and I'd assume that he has some of them now as well. But he just found other factories. So those factories that he was not able to continue to work with because they had been reported, he found other factories. So since then, he's done like a Luke training Dagobah figure in the cutoff sleeves. He's done a slave Leia. He's done a really cool Tatooine outside the cantina sort of speeder. It's a little bulb thing. It looks really, really great. So he continues to produce figures. There's a lot about him and Stan Solo on YouTube and a lot on Etsy and eBay.
Now, one of the things I find interesting and ironic, because we have you as an interview person from China, is you've got a guy in Wales and you've got a guy in the US that, let's just call them the masterminds, but neither one of them are physically producing the product. They've all outsourced it to China.
I mean, this is the name of the game right now. Everybody is going to be producing here. But from the videos I've seen with Mr. Smith, my understanding, he's been to the factories in the early days. He works tirelessly with the product development with the factories, videos, telling them that's not good enough. I want it better, all hours of the night. It's the reason why he stopped the first company originally. It was that it was too much. It was too taxing on him to be so demanding of what was being made at the factories in China. So that's really what it requires. I mean, Walmart, when they're producing goods, I have friends who live in Hong Kong or Guangzhou. I mean, Walmart has people over here that are in the factories every day, all day, looking at stuff and going, no, this is what it needs to be. The quality control is an issue for everybody. And a lot of it turned up being completely remote, during COVID, of course. So that's probably continuing too. I've got friends who've been back in the States that are coming over, working in product development, that are coming over to China for their first time in 3-4 years, where they maybe used to come for 3 months at a time every year.
Interesting. How you being in China and having some insight there. Maybe this is a dumb question, but how significant is it that China is producing the bulk of the products that are sold around the world?
I'd say it's significant for the people here because it's not really a third world country anymore, the way that people might have viewed it back when, say, Kenner started. It probably wasn't even Kenner. Kenner was doing Vietnam, Mexico, and Hong Kong. And it was probably Hasbro that really started with producing things in really large quantities in China during the late 80s into the 90s. So like all of the Power of the Force. Now you're looking at Transformers. Once they were not Takara, but like Hasbro was probably all being manufactured here as well. So I think what it's done long term is given a lot of advancement to the economy here, and therefore the people, the middle class increasing, the upper middle class increasing, and then China deciding we're going to branch. Companies like Alibaba start producing their own toys. We've got a lot of Chinese manufacturers now that are producing fantastic toys, like the same quality as Hot Toys, but a third or a quarter of the cost.
Well, and the lesser cost is simply due to the fact that people will work for less money.
Certainly, that's a part of it. Also, they've grown very efficient with production, with automated production. I mean, there's a city nearby here where they're doing automated, basically city fabrication, and they're sending ready-made cities to places like Africa where they can put this infrastructure up after it arrives on a ship and it's all ready to go. So it's quite powerful what they're able to do now. We think of made in China as it's going to fall apart in a couple of weeks. That remains the case for some things and for a lot of things, but they also have managed, if you look at some of their domestic brands that are quite contentious in global markets, but the quality of a lot of goods here are getting better and better.
Fantastic information. I'm learning a lot as we go along. Back to my normal questions. What is, and I'm sorry, Jack, I'm stepping on your toes here. I need to make a better mark. I'll let you go ahead and ask that question. Sorry.
Well, I was actually going to follow up with some of the Stan Solo stuff. My first question with that was, have they always come carded, or were the original Stan Solo figures sold loose?
Both. He has options on his Etsy store and his UK store. You can choose, like a snout nose. That's a Stan Solo figure. Mm-hmm. And he came loose for me, but on his website, you've got options for both loose or carded. So it just depends on the consumer.
And then to follow up with that, you had mentioned that you prefer the 3 3/4 inch figures, especially a lot of the vintage figures are now the retro collection because of the box art. But at the same time, you open some figures because of the dioramas. So I just want to know, who what is that decision making if you're going to open it or keep it mock?
So if I'm finding loose figures for sale and the value is good, I will buy them and then I can use those. Or even starting to, this was a COVID day, like rip off Luke's head and custom. create pimping Lando figure, because I just had some extras. For the retros now, I typically buy 2 of each. If it's a figure I don't already have in vintage. So I think I've managed to collect over 50 of the original vintage line loose, and none of them are gradable. I've maybe got 1 loose forlom who might pass some grading, but they're all just beaters the way that I kind of want them right now. So if I've got about 53 or 55 loose vintage Kenner and I'm missing about 20, and the retro starts filling in those gaps, then I'll buy 2 of each. So like the Imperial Guard that's above me, that is not vintage. That's a retro with the retro carded. But then along there, the Leia and some of the other figures, the Obi-Wan Kenobi, those are all original vintage displayed in front of the retro line.
Oh, I see. Okay. So they're loose figures, but you just put the retro behind there with the card. That way it kind of gives you that look that it's still in there.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
You had mentioned that you've been kind of actively collecting for the last 3 years. No collection at all prior to that?
There definitely was nothing from my childhood. Pretty normal in my parts. Garage sales. You want a pair of basketball shoes? Garage sale.
Wow.
So, and then losing interest as I got really heavily into basketball, especially in sports. And it probably wasn't until college, I was out west in Vancouver, British Columbia, and started to get into collecting again. Used to go down to Tacoma, Washington, because they had like a KB toys down there that we didn't have KB in Canada. So started collecting Power of the Force, and then started going to a few comic shops in Vancouver. But I was a student with student loan debt. So I did build up a pretty good collection, which is no longer kind of a part of my life after university. So then coming to China, it wasn't really on my radar because it's China. Star Wars is not an entity here. And so for a long time, before we had like our version of eBay and things like that, where these figures started popping up, that's when I started getting into it again. Because you can't go to a Toys R Us here and find anything Star Wars. You can find hundreds of Transformers, but you cannot find a single Star Wars figure. Marvel, yes. Power Rangers, lots of it. But G.I. Joe, or now some of the 80s lines that are coming out again, and they're doing the retro figures, you can't find any of that. So it was probably, a few years ago that I joined a toy collecting group on our sort of mobile platform, like WhatsApp, but it's called WeChat. Mm-hmm. And there's a group of 100 or more of us on there that are mostly all expats, and we're all nerds, and we like to collect. And it's highly motivating in all the wrong ways when some dude's like, oh, check out these new toys, mail call, and you've got like boxes like this of toys. So it kind of engendered the community of collecting a lot, and people were sharing links to like purchases, because we cannot find things in the wild. The wild for us is on that. But there's a lot that we can find. So then it was just fun to like, let's see what I can find. I remember one day when I found the walker, the chicken walker, the ATST, I found that loose for like, again, like $50, $70, something like that. It's like, okay, I'll get that. And then it just started made me wonder, how many more figures can I find that are actually vintage here in China that I can buy, that I can own? So it started things down a snowballing path for sure. So yeah, the last 3 years has been when it has become sort of seriously an addiction. Yeah.
You mentioned something a moment ago, and I've been thinking about it, and I've been trying to figure out how to ask the question, and that is the difference between, I'll use the word societies, whether it be the US, the UK, Australia, versus China. And I'll separate them by saying my assumption is China will produce a lot of stuff, but they're not into it. Meaning, let's talk Star Wars. In Australia, in the UK, in the United States, everybody's all gung-ho Star Wars. Everybody knows who Luke, Han, and Leia is, but maybe over in China, it's not of any interest, or certainly not as big and popular as it would be over here, and yet they manufacture it. Is that the case for a lot of things, or does it have to have some Chinese birth, for lack of a better description, for the Chinese society to be interested in it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. It definitely makes sense. I mean, obviously, the current generation of kids growing up, even with the great firewall, have a lot of exposure to international and Western branding. It's everywhere. Barbie right now is through the roof. There are Barbie cafes and Barbie displays taking over whole shopping malls here right now. And the movie made a ton of money. So there is an interest. Probably, like, for example, my wife's cousin, who's a local guy. My wife is local to Hangzhou. She's Chinese. My wife's cousin, you know, grew up with Gundam and Transformers, and those were huge for him as a kid. Transformers has always had a large footprint here. The movies make a ton of money. You can find the toys everywhere. Lots of people collect them, lots of local people. Marvel and DC is quite big here, where a lot of local collectors, and you'll find them in stores. Obviously, a lot of Japanese influence. Anime, Gundam is very, very big here. You can find full stores of Gundam. So I guess what differs is it's not that they're not consumers here. They're high level of consumption for toys in China. But it's the same as us. Like, I remember going to a neighbor who was Japanese, who immigrated over from Japan, and great kid. And we had a lot of fun, but I didn't like playing with his toys. My brother did, but it just wasn't my thing. The Shogun Warriors and some of this stuff, it wasn't my background. So I think it's kind of similar in that way. However, it's starting to change because since Rogue One, all of the films have been shown here. I've been able to see them all and did okay, but probably the Disney imprint, like Grogu is, everyone here knows Grogu. I work at a primary school. I'm an academic director working with, they're all local kids. And they learn half of all of their lessons in English. So it's a bilingual program that we arranged.
Interesting.
And when I brought my talking Grogu to school one day, all the kids knew Grogu.
Wow.
So Grogu is kind of changing things for people over here.
Okay.
So I don't think it'll ever have the footprint that some of the brands that have history here, like Transformers, like Gundam, like Power Rangers is big here. Star Wars will never catch up to that. But like G.I. Joes, if I wanted to collect next week, if I wanted to buy 50 carded vintage G.I. Joe figures, I could easily. More than I can get of Star Wars vintage. Because there, for some reason, G.I. Joe is something was happening back in the day that people were watching it, getting into it. The knockoff thing. So now if we're going to move from custom reproductions to straight up knockoff counterfeit, I've got a box of counterfeit repro G.I. Joe guys named Commando who are really wonky with terrible back cards. And these were produced back in the day in China. And I've got a box of these that I spent like $20 on a whole box. There's like 15 of them. So there's a big G.I. Joe footprint, and I'm not really sure where that one has come from.
Now, there's about 3 different levels of G.I. Joe, though. In fact, ironically, I'm just going to give our host here, our co-host here, Jack, a little plug. He does another video series where he literally unboxes items that he stashed away years ago. And I've always commented or complimented him on the ability to buy something, not open it, and package it away with the intent of someday this will have some value. And so that particular series he does is called Jack in the Box. He is also a fan of G.I. Joe, but correct me if I'm wrong, it's the 3 3/4 inch G.I. Joe, which may kind of also be called Cobra?
Well, so the overall line specifically is called A Real American Hero.
Okay.
Those were the G.I. Joes that came out in around 1982 that Shannon's kind of pointing to there, that storm shadow that's on his glass. And yeah, they would be 3 3/4 inch action figures, and Cobra is kind of the enemy against G.I. Joe.
Aha.
Right.
Okay. Well,
so G.I. Joe is the code name for this military group and they have an enemy, and their code name is Cobra.
Interesting. Now, supposedly tomorrow, Jack and I are doing another interview between him and myself on G.I. Joe, but those are going to be the 1960s G.I. Joe, which is what I grew up with. And I bet between now and tomorrow morning, I have to study up to make sure I've got my dates and different versions correct. But to come back to what you're talking about, if someone wanted to find true vintage 1965-66 G.I. Joe, the 12-inch ones, is that something A, of interest, or B, even available in China? Hi there, I'm Jim Stein. I'd like to share with you some of my Star Wars collectibles. Stepping away from the 18-inch line and jumping up to the large 31-inch line is this Darth Vader, as well as a clone trooper. Darth Vader is quite detailed and very frightening in his look. He too is in an open package and well secured inside there, has a nice cloth cape around him, and then the clone trooper is painted in some very uniquely white and orange colors. Thanks for taking a few moments to take a look at what I have in my Star Wars collection, and make it a point to come on back for future episodes. In the meantime, may the Force be with you.
Blast him!
C-3PO is fluent in over how many forms of communication? Over 6 million. Did you get the correct answer? Either way, we hope you enjoyed testing your knowledge of all things Star Wars and had fun along the way.
This is Jack in the Box. We finally get our box back from CAS.
Me? Poetry?
We don't just spread fun through action figures, we get close and personal with the actors that played these characters.
I'm Nick Joseph, and I played Major Aho Extrafon.
You were the one that banged his head in that doorway?
Yes, that's me, yes.
And then they dressed me as a Hoth rebel.
Be sure to subscribe and binge watch all of our episodes. Thanks for tuning in to Jack in the Box.
Absolutely not, unfortunately.
Okay.
I don't know where they weren't made here.
Yeah.
Where, again, Hasbro made G.I. Joe, Real American Hero. The 80s G.I. Joes have always been Hasbro's baby. And I know Hasbro was the company producing the 12-inch figures back in the 60s and 70s, but productions were probably happening in different countries. The 80s was that sweet spot where Hasbro likely moved their production to China. And that's where the G.I. Joe, a Real American Hero line came in. So that's why there's quite a bit. I've got a shelf. I've started to take over other parts of the apartment. I do get a lot of flack for it, but it's happening. So I've got just a mixed 80s shelf of Masters of the Universe and quite a lot of G.I. Joe on it right now. But I've been getting the loose figures. Like I've got a Zartan and 2 Storm Shadows and a Bat that are all original vintage, but they're all really beaten up.
Let me I'll go off on a G.I. Joe tangent since Shannon brought it up. Do you have to change those O-rings, or are those original O-rings on those G.I. Joe characters?
The original O-rings are there. A few of the joints are very, I like, what does Melville say in Toy Chasers? Very wonky or janky. You can just shake them. So I've got them propped up against something. Mm-hmm. A few of them are quite good. The Storm Shadow is great. My Zartan has no eyebrows anymore. And in the sun, he'll get a little ashy. That's about it.
Right.
So they're quite beaten up, but the O-rings are still good.
That's awesome. All right. Nice collection.
Just to piggyback onto the old GI Joes again, I've collected the old 60s ones, and the thing that I find bizarre is, unlike current GI Joe or even Star Wars, they're 99% plastic. You might find a couple of figures that have a cloth cape, but most of them come with a plastic cape. The early GI Joes, all of the uniforms were cloth.
Yes.
And so the day that I fell out of the Star Wars collection and into the GI Joe collection and started ordering GI Joe, the moment I opened that first box, there was this, some might call it an odor, some might call it an aroma that came from the box, which I believe is essentially the deterioration of the cloth.
Wow.
But there is a peculiar odor or smell that emanates from them. And many people have said that smell is one of the greatest triggers of memory. So every time I smell that, it's like it kind of takes me back a little bit. But I just thought it was interesting that the GI Joe, it was always the same plastic figure, and the variations were predominantly in the uniform they wore. But then at some point there would have been a change from the molded plastic hair to the fuzzy hair.
I remember the fuzzy hair and the one who went in the water, but that would have been like my older cousins. My cousins who are older than me would have been collecting the 12-inch figures, and for us being legit 80s kids, where we were the perfect age to suck into those little plastic figures, I didn't like the doll GI Joes. That's what we used to say.
Yes. In fact, and I thought a little bit about it earlier today. And in fact, in our original Star Wars Collectors episode #1, there's a point in there where I make the comment that I started out collecting the 12-inch GI Joes, but there was this stigma that boys don't play with dolls. And I'm not 100% certain about it. And I may have made this statement once before, but I believe this is where the phrase action figure came in, was a way of separating dolls, call it Barbie dolls, from toys that boys would play with. And so
it was Hasbro.
Okay, so
it was Hasbro,
and it came up with that phrase, action figures, a way defining the difference between them. So there, and that may come up again tomorrow when we do our interview there. I also want
Jim.
Yes,
Jim. In the, sorry to interrupt. In the 80s, we weren't fooled. We knew they were dolls. You had to dress them.
Yes. I don't remember Barbie ever coming with a Jeep or a trailer that had a cannon on it, though, or regardless of spotlight. But then I think she did have a convertible Corvette at some point. But you had mentioned something just a moment ago about encroaching into other spaces, which brings me back to our series of questions. Your display space. Its size, is it walls, is it a room? You've already indicated it's expanding beyond where, say, the wife would like it to be. How big, how much more can you go? Are you restricted?
Definitely restricted. Apartments in China are not big, and we've got our 2-bedroom, and it's not only my home. And already I've probably taken up more space than would be appreciated. So I mean, basically behind me is where I display. I've got 2 shelves there and bookshelves and a little bit under the TV. And I've got a corner cabinet where I just switch out sort of diorama displays and things like that. I've only recently taken over a display near our eating area because there's nothing up there. If you don't put anything up there, I'm going to. But that's about it. So a lot of it, like I said, today's the first day where I feel like I've got 2/3 or so, more than half of the collection out. The rest of it are in a variety of boxes. We've got a huge bed compartment that you lift the mattress up. So, I mean, that's all my toys basically. Expansion will not happen. Expansion will not happen anytime soon. You dream of a day where you've got a basement like John's that you guys spoke to earlier in your series. That is a fantastic dream.
There are a few people we've interviewed that I find it amazing, the space that they encompass or have taken over or been allowed to take over. I have an entire guest room here that is now a Star Wars room, but some of these other people we spoke to, their displays are 2, 3, 4 times bigger than mine. The displays, as I can see, are predominantly shelved. I assume some of the stuff is pinned up there. I don't see anything that's suspended.
No, yeah, and nothing is pinned. So those are retro figures displayed at the front. This is bad for cards, I know, but I'm not planning on reselling them. So I've got figures stacked behind them. So what you're seeing at the front, there are 3 carded figures behind all of those. And then what I'll do is on a Saturday when I'm bored, I'll decide on a Power of the Force on the front row, or I'll decide on another line on the front row, and I'll kind of recycle them through so they don't spend too much time getting bent. And if it's not able to stand, I'm not going to really be able to display it other than in those ways.
Interesting. And from what I can see, there's a couple of shelves and a nice table back there. These shelves are wooden, I assume. You built them, they were there, you added them. I don't know if you have IKEA in China.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We go for the meatballs. We do have IKEA. It's very busy, very popular.
Oh, wow.
Some of
okay,
the stuff,
cool.
very, very popular. Some of the stuff is from IKEA. This is a secondhand home. And basically when you buy a home here, you'll spend quite a bit of money to redo it. It's not a furnished home when you get it. So that shelving unit was there when we bought it on the walls, and then everything else we bought as the workers were redoing cabinetry, the sinks, everything in the floor. The floor we didn't change, doors and things like that. So the majority of it is what the wife thankfully went ahead and took care of furnishing the place with, and now I've repaid her by stacking it full of toys. This is actually my son's homework desk. It's normally overlooking the window and the river that we're near, but otherwise I would have just been talking to you with a TV behind me. So I took advantage of the chance to put some toys on it.
And I see what I'm going to call kind of Christmas tree lights up there. Do you have any particular lighting effects, whether to enhance or color or brighten up?
Just those, and those are just a holdover from one of our first Christmases here, and had some little dinky lights up for Christmas time, and just like, yep, those look good. They're going to stay. That's about it.
And then my next question would be, is the displays, how are they arranged, whether it be age, episode, character, or scene? But I think you already indicated you just kind of every once in a while just rotate and do a different collection or show off or display.
Yeah, so right now it's a mix of all the Return of the Jedi and some Empire Strikes Back. So normally by line, like power, it'll be all orange Power of the Force, or all green Power of the Force, or episode 1 I've done because I've got quite a few of episode 1, or like these are really great figures. These expanded universe figures, those might go up once in a while across the whole row because I've got enough of those. So yeah, just I'll try to have some logic at least to what's being displayed, or the diorama I just pulled apart to display stuff was just the Mando's ship with a lot of the retro figures from the Mandalorian show kind of surrounding around that.
Very cool. And then, you talked about there's this like one place that a American or Canadian person opened up that's like your toy store that you can go to, but for the most part, there's not a bunch of toy stores in China. I'm curious if you wanted to buy something like Powers of the Force or G.I. Joe or Transformers, something that is popular there, are those sold in stores, or is it really just limited the Star Wars stuff that's hard to find?
Okay, so comic store / toy store, there are now 2 in the country. So we're a country of what, however billion people China has. There are 2 American style comic book / collectible toy stores. So one of them opened by a friend from the States, Matt, and he supplies me with my comics.
Okay.
I'm always buying comics from him. And then toy stores, they're everywhere. So Toys R Us is huge here. There was no bankruptcy in China. That was never an issue. Toys R Us makes a lot of money here in China. So we've got Toys R Us, we've got Hamley, which is a British chain, I think, and just lots of other local toy stores. If you walked into that store and you were a Transformer fan, you're in luck. If you are a G.I. Joe or a Star Wars fan, get out the door. You're not going to find a single thing. Maybe a few Disney things. And okay, Shanghai has a Disney here, and there is a Star Wars hot toy store at the Shanghai Disney where you can get stuff. Basically, you have to use one of 2 online buying platforms. One of them is like eBay. One of them is all new stuff. So it's like you go on there and you'll search, and you'll find registered stores and sellers, and you'll find lots and lots of Power of the Force, especially on there, very, very cheap. Like I sent a video of me hunting in the wild, which is me on my phone. And the second app that we use it's all secondhand. So it's all individual sellers who have collections for some reason, and lots of Power of the Force on there. So the video I sent is like me scrolling and finding a Power of the Force Han Solo. It was like $3, less than $3, $2.50. And so I got that. So that arrived last week, carded, great shape.
Wow.
So there's lots out there, but you just can't see it walking around.
I see. Okay. So a lot of online shopping for you when you're making your purchases.
100% online.
Got it.
And that online stuff is stuff that is originates and is shipped to you within China, or it comes from outside China?
All within China, maybe Hong Kong. So this is one of the challenges that all of us collectors here face. Difficult to get access to eBay. Maybe that's a good thing. But everything is already within China. So it's also, it can be bad too, because I would enjoy spending my weekend out in the wild. My dad lives in Long Island, in New York. I'm looking for the day where we can go back, and along Long Island, I'm going to stop in all the hamlets and go to as many comic and toy stores as I possibly can, right? That to me would be a dream of a weekend or a trip back when I see my dad. You've got to go out and look for it. You can buy stuff on eBay, but for me, it wouldn't be the same. If I was back home, I would take great pleasure in vintage hunting. That's why I love a lot of the YouTube videos where guys are doing that. Here, you can pretty much get a bug. Like if you've had 2 beers and one guy in this group sends like mail call, you'll be like, oh boy, here we go. And you'll start scrolling, and before you know it, you've got 5 shipments on the way.
A thought occurred to me as you mentioned Long Island, and I'm trying to remember who it was. But I bet you if you scroll back through our previous interviews, I know we've done 1 or 2 different people from Long Island that you could quite possibly send them a message.
Hi, I'm Dan. I'm from Long Island, New York.
All right. My name's Jerome. I'm from New York, Shoreham on Long Island.
And they would tell you
Okay.
where the store is in that part of town, and maybe even meet you there so they could spend some money as well, or at the least introduce you to the friend that they have in that store. I still want to continue down the source questioning that Jack asked you. I recall the two people that we interviewed out of Australia, both seem to their local toy store, but both of them mentioned Facebook Marketplace. And I've not heard you mention Facebook at all. Why?
No. Well, I mean, it would be hard to purchase the things. So there's two streams to this. The first is, you know, China blocks access to things like that, but we use virtual private networks. We use VPNs, so access to Facebook, YouTube, etc. I've got it on my Apple TV. You can get through that. But what's really difficult is like we can't set up PayPal, which is the big one. So we've got a credit card that allows you to access foreign markets, but every time you do it, the bank is going to call you, and there's a lot of propaganda, here, scaring locals into like not using their money outside of China. So it would just be so challenging.
Some irony
for
to
me
that
to buy.
statement you just made.
I'm aware. Very aware.
Interesting. Well, I guess I just assume that those who, in Australia who are looking on Facebook Marketplace, and this would even be my case. I mean, I wouldn't go to Facebook Marketplace to buy something out of Australia or the UK. My assumption is it would be local people to me. So I'm going to assume that there's no Facebook/local market via Facebook to you.
Not via Facebook. Yeah.
Okay.
No. I mean, we've got this one group on our mobile platform. Can't remember exactly how many members, but it's well over 100. So there is some, like, we'll do trades. I've traded some Simpsons figures and gotten back really cool sculptures of Palpatine and Yoda, and we just pay for each other's sort of shippings type thing. Sometimes folks will post things they want to sell, and sometimes folks will buy them, but we're typically just using it to motivate each other's addiction than to be selling back and forth to each other. It's not really a marketplace, it's more of a community. So yeah, basically it's the second app that I mentioned, which is all secondhand, so all individual sellers. If I wanted to sell anything, I could just take a picture and upload it, and I could sell it on this app, you know, as quickly as I could, as quickly as someone would want to buy it. And there's not really bidding either. You set the price, the person can contact you, you can negotiate, and then they'll choose to buy it or not.
And I'm assuming that in addition to Facebook Marketplace, there's no local eBay there?
Yeah, it's called Taobao. It's, you know, Alibaba is such a giant, the company and the genie, but Alibaba basically designed all of the e-commerce platforms that China uses. So our eBay, it's kind of split in two. Like in eBay now, right, back for you guys, you'll have registered sellers that are selling new products, and you'll have registered individuals who are selling personal products or used items. That's split into two for us. So we have two giant platforms. They're huge. It's where like everybody does their shopping for everything. My t-shirts that just arrived, my Storm Shadow glass, all of this is everything I have is from one of these two platforms.
The Cantina band's pretty cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
So is it actually called eBay, or is it called Alibaba, or some other name?
It's called Taobao.
And it's not the Chinese version of eBay, meaning they're not the same company. It's just a similar company that's separate.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes.
Interesting. My next question, although I think I already know the answer, is who is the collector?
In the family?
Yeah.
Yeah. You're looking at him. The guy with these thumbs.
And your wife?
Yeah, and even my son.
Your wife or son, do they collect anything?
My wife collects Lululemon and Skechers.
Okay.
And my son,
Skechers as
the
in
shoes.
the shoes. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. And it's because of
my
the
son,
different patterns.
yeah, definitely all the patterns. Yeah. No, and my son, when he was young, obviously, Christmas, birthdays, you force lightsabers into his hands. You buy him something that you end up taking and putting on a shelf for yourself. I tried my best, but it has been a failed misery in that term. My son's teachers, sometimes in Chinese schools, your child's teachers will come to your home to have sort of just a sit down about how everything's going. Uh, how's Asher feeling at school? Anything you want us to be focused on for Asher? Um, it's just a talk. They're not trying to come see like are bad things happening in the home, but it's just a conference. It's sort of like a student teacher parent conference in the home, and the teachers walk in and sit on the sofa, which is across from me, and look up, and they're like, Asher, you have a lot of toys. No, those are my dad's.
That's funny. That's funny. Aside from yourself, your wife, and the kids, who sees your collection, and including the teacher?
Yeah, the cat.
Okay.
She gets a little too close sometimes to the collection. We've got friends over here, but house parties are not really a thing in China. Don't really like come over, we'll make nachos and dip and watch a football game. It's not even me. Like, I can't remember the last time we've done it. So yeah, not many people. That's why this is pretty cool, this opportunity to talk to you guys about collecting. Outside of the few friends on this group that we have, this community where we're sending pictures to each other, face to face, coming into the space, not very often. Once in a while, I'll take some of my collection to the school and carefully bring it into the students and allow them to hold it with their fingertips. And they're quite marveled at the age of some of these things when they see like 1977 on the back of an original toy. That's kind of mind blowing to them because they don't keep stuff like that. There's no there's no vintage stores here. You go in and buy like a used t-shirt. It's not really a part of the culture here.
Interesting. And kind of going back to who sees the collection, I always ask that question to all of the people that we interview, and it's really kind of awkward, the answers that come back, because the answer typically is the gas man, the guy who came in to repair the dryer last week. I mean, people typically either don't share, and I don't know if that's the right word, but they tend to kind of keep it to themselves and only allow a small little inside group of people to come see their stuff. It's not something that's grandly displayed, and I don't think it's a case of trying to hide it from anybody. It's just, it's more of a personal thing.
Yeah, I think it points to the inner motivation. It's maybe one of the purest forms of doing something just for yourself. Especially in the modern world that we're living in right now, where sometimes we'll question the motivations for the photos that we post or the attention that someone may or may not be looking for. This is one of the things where you're just doing it for you. And I think that's kind of special.
I'd like to ask a question, and it's one that's not on the list, but a lot of times it's something that tends to come out through the interview, and it's one of the things that I find fascinating. When you were a kid, I assume were interested in Star Wars. I mean, when did you see the first Star Wars movie?
The first one would have been on VHS because I was born the 4 months after it came out in 77. So the first one I would have seen in the theaters was Empire Strikes Back. But I can't remember if I went with my mom or my dad, because my folks have been divorced for many, many years. It could have been one or the other. And then, there was Star Wars re-released quite a few times. I'm not talking about the special edition. I'm just saying during the 80s in Canada, we get like a double bill where you'd watch the first one and then you'd watch Empire. So I remember that. And I remember seeing the special edition in the theater, but I was much older at that time. But my childhood memories, I don't have snapshots. I listened to, I think, Troy talk about some of his experiences at the drive-in and not having a speaker ready.
I was just telling that story to a person on the phone the other day. I mean, Dad took him to the drive-in movie theater, which Dad arrived late, and then they couldn't find a post that had a speaker on it, so they left. I mean, the kid was traumatized.
I'm looking up at this big screen, and my father was the kind of guy, he never got to a movie on time. It was always in the middle of the movie. I'm like, but that's just how he was. So he's driving the car. I'm looking out the window like this, and I look up and I see this giant car floating in the air. And I'm like, oh, I'm just speechless. Okay. He couldn't find a speaker that would work. And we left the drive-in right then and there. And I was devastated. I was devastated.
Oh, that close.
Yeah. I mean, that he was a very good storyteller, and you could tell that there was strong imprints, right, of these memories. This is a snapshot that I can pull out and look at whenever I want to. I don't really have that for a lot of things related to being very, very young and Star Wars, because at that time I was probably just a typical kid. You know, for a while it was probably BMX bikes and the Star Wars were packed away. And then when you realize that G.I. Joe looked cooler in the sandbox at the park, G.I. Joe became a thing. So it probably wasn't, again, it was more just that it was the thread that it stayed with you throughout. And then realizing that some of the books are quite cool, Heir to the Empire, when that comes out. You're like, yeah, I'm going to read that. And then meeting a few friends again who look back and talk about Star Wars. I did line up for hours and hours to watch episode 1. That I remember. I remember the fanfare and the feeling. I did not cosplay, but there were a lot of people who were in the theater in Richmond, British Columbia. I remember getting into the theater. I remember the opening crawl. I remember that shiny ship flying down and going, strange, shiny. It's very shiny for Star Wars. And I remember the feeling in a couple of moments of the film and some confusion and some like strong exhilaration, especially at the Duel of the Fates. And then walking out and talking to my friends because we were in college and kind of being like, do we watch it again? Yeah. So I remember that, but childhood stuff, not so much.
Interesting.
Shannon, with your collection that you have now, would you say that there is a favorite item amongst your collection, or maybe an item that you kind of showcase more than any other?
I think so I managed to get 2 speeder bikes and 2 ATSTs. One of them is boxed and it's over in the corner over there. Mm-hmm. That to me was the coolest, the one that I just feel so lucky that I got it, like a boxed Return of the Jedi ATST with the stickers still ready to put onto the item. Because for me, the vehicle box art does have a lasting memory for me. I do have snapshots of walking in, my dad living in New York, walking into Toys R Us because we didn't have Toys R Us at that time in Canada, and the wall of box art of the vehicles and how special that was. So being able to get not only one loose, but one boxed and have 2 of those was pretty neat, because I never thought I'd be able to find boxed vintage legitimate vehicles here.
Got it. And to follow up, I know earlier you had mentioned that Empire Strikes Back was one of your favorite memories, the first film that you actually watched in the Star Wars saga. What do you think of these kind of like, since Disney's taken over and especially gone to Disney Plus with some of these television series, do you get those in China? And if you are watching them, what do you think of those?
So I have Disney Plus on the TV, and I do subscribe to it. I kind of subscribe when a new show comes out on Star Wars, and then I'll unsubscribe once I've watched all of it. And look, I am a glass half full kind of person. In all that I do, I try to look at the positive, and I try to just enjoy having something rather than having nothing. I'd go on the side of like, I want something. And I always was fascinated by the special effects. Even growing up in college, I did 2 years of film school, and the motivation behind that was watching the old ILM documentaries and having a book about the kit bashing and the model making and the motion control cameras and the matte painting, and all of that was really, really fascinating to me. So I did a program in digital arts because there was no more education anyways in terms of schooling for the original ways that they were making the films. So I was always really interested in that. And what always got me was, man, I would love to see that old stuff updated. I love the old films, but you know, when the Force Awakens came out, the scenes of the Falcon flying are exhilarating. There's no other way to put it. It is true that what they can do with modern effects. And so I have issues with a lot of the story beats and story choices and character portrayals that have occurred pretty much across every show, except for maybe Mando season 1, season 2, and Andor. Andor to me is a fantastic piece of Star Wars mythology, and I get why folks don't get it, don't enjoy it. But I just love the full narrative, connected. I love the character portrayals. I love the acting. I love the nuance of the show and the thoughtfulness of the show, and sort of the maturity of the show. So that to me was a real highlight. But you know, like Ahsoka spinning on a spaceship, doing flips, dodging TIE fighter bullets while she's outside. Yeah, I get it. That's meant for a cartoon. But it was neat. And there were lots of parts of that Ahsoka show that I will go back and watch. Like I've rewatched episode 5 when Anakin returns 3 times probably, because I'm a sucker for how people have embraced Anakin later on, and because of the vitriol that he faced as a character and an actor back when episode 2 came out, especially, or the Obi-Wan series. You can't not love watching some of the Vader Obi-Wan stuff, or Vader dragging people through the village, breaking their necks. Like that to me is some of the beautiful stuff that they have been able to create. And I'll try to remember that and rewatch some of that stuff, and I'll just ignore the parts that like bug me.
Right. Okay.
Very interesting. I really loved Andor, and I've watched it again since a second time. And as opposed to watching the weekly episodes, the second time I watched it, I think I tended to do it all in a weekend. And so you have a much better collective idea of the whole story. And I very, very much enjoyed it. And I'm looking forward to the next season. Ahsoka, I had a hard time with. But to kind of wrap things up, my question to you, and writing on the fact that you're in China, what advice would you give to collectors in general? And then assuming you've got friends and other, we'll just call them Chinese collectors, what advice would you give to them?
Do what makes you happy. I mean, it's what probably everyone would say, right? You're doing it for yourself. We talked about that a little bit earlier, right? It's probably the purest form of self-indulgence, where if you're not sharing it with anybody, then obviously it's just for you. And so why wouldn't you do what makes you happy and don't worry about everything else? But the one thing, I'm not a big social media proponent. I don't use a lot of platforms, really. And it's not just because I live in China. If I were back home, it would be the same, because I don't like how it pulls us into the silos where it's very easy to find people who are very like-minded and then therefore feel very separated or even antagonistic towards people who are looking at things from different ways. Unfortunately, social media and the algorithms of a platform like YouTube are driving these wedges. One of the things I love about what this has been for me, you guys reaching out to me for, is a great example of that, is toy collecting. It seems to me there are some divisions. I see them. I see them on YouTube. I see them on Facebook. But for the most part, it's like bringing people together. And it's been one of the ways where I think social media has been a really positive, is people all over the world with that shared common likeness. I think that's a powerful thing. So looking for community is cool too. That's another piece of advice, is like, yeah, find groups, because it's probably one of the only places where people will be more positive than negative in terms of group messaging and stuff like that today.
Very good, very good answers. Very good answers. Well, I want to thank you very, very much for participating. I've enjoyed all of the answers and the insight that you've given us. And I still find it very exciting that we've been able to reach another area of the world and to see how people in that part of the world acquire and disseminate their interests and such in toys. So again, I do thank you very, very much. And I enjoyed your information about the Stan Solo and the Smith Lord explanation too, because we've never heard of that stuff before.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Jim, for reaching out to me. It was a real pleasure. Can't remember the last time I got to sit and chat about stuff like this. So it's something I've looked forward to, and it definitely made we're early in November, but definitely made my month, maybe my fall. Let's say it made my fall. Thank you guys.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you as well, Shannon. I'll just, before we break here, I'll just remind everyone, if you've made it this far in the video, go ahead and like this video. Also comment down below if you have any questions for myself, for Jim, or for Shannon. Comments or questions, go ahead and leave that down in the comments. We'll be watching those, and we'll answer any questions or comments that anyone poses. And lastly, I'll remind everyone to go ahead and subscribe to the channel. As Shannon says, that's the best way to bring the community together. So subscribe to the channel, binge watch all of our videos. From myself, Jim, Shannon, I like to end it with, may the force be with you, my friend.
Bye, guys. May the force be with you.